Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this keynote session this afternoon. And it is my pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you our first keynote speaker of the conference this afternoon, Dr. Nthabiseng Motsemme. Now, Dr. Motsemme is currently the director, the academic director at the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And she is also a research fellow at both the University of Johannesburg Sociology Department and Nelson Mandela University's Center for Women and Gender Studies. Her research interests include African feminist and womanist theories, African cultural production and subjectivities, townships and township women's shifting identities, truth and reconciliation commissions, and women's testimonies and memories, and women's experiences and transformation in higher education. She currently serves on the editorial boards of the journals African Identities and Feminist Legal Studies. And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Motsemme a number of years ago at UNISA, where she was working in the research office. It is lovely to get connected again in this way, and it is wonderful to welcome you back to UNISA and Nthabiseng, albeit in this virtual way. Dr. Motsemme's talk today is entitled African Women's Sacred/Spiritual Violations and the Healing of Our Historical Wounds, an African Womanist Reflection. Dr. Motsemme will first deliver her talk, and then there will be a question and answer session afterwards where the audience can respond by either typing in the chat box or by raising their hands. Very, very welcome, Dr. Motsemme. We are looking forward to hearing your talk, and the floor, or the screen at least, is now yours.
Greetings, everyone. Lovely to be here this Monday afternoon. I was just saying to both Leandra and Lenka, we linked in a few minutes earlier, that forgive me if I warm into the speech. I've just been coming out of meetings the whole day, and I've just been looking forward to being in this space and seeing all of you. I'm seeing all the names, some familiar names, so I already feel comfortable and, you know, breathing in and out as well. It's just such a pleasure to be part of the Feminist Readings in Motion International Conference. I would like to thank firstly the conference organizers. All of you know what it takes to organize a conference, particular virtual one, and particular one which was, I remember, initially planned last year, April, and then things had to shift and change as the world was thrown, on its feet and knees in some ways by COVID-19. So it's just good to see everybody that they're well, that they're healthy as well. I'd also just like to thank in particular Dr. Lenka Blikova. I hope I got it right, Lenka. Who's really been patient and kind throughout this process as we had to shift and change things. It's been such a pleasure linking up with you and, walking us through the administrative of how to get our way around this conference as well. And I think my fellow keynote speakers would also, Professor Denai Mupotsa and Professor Kusoa Adumako Ampofo as well, would agree with me as well. And again, just from me, it's really just a virtual applause to everybody in the background, Leandra, everyone, for bringing us all together in such important spaces. I've come to appreciate these spaces more and more and more. Being in currently I'm still in a managerial administrative space. So this space of just reflection and thinking through, I've truly come to, appreciate the value of what it means, particularly for people who are thinking through issues around women on the continent, around oppressed women globally as well. So I'm really, really want to just extend my gratitude. I also, so as Leandra has mentioned, my address is entitled Violation of Sacred Spirit of the Sacred Spiritual and the Healings of Our Historical Wounds in African Women's Memories of Political Violence, and African Womanist Approach. these are thoughts, friends and colleagues. So this is work that's kind of been seeing this thread in my work for a number of years. And I thought, let me just zone in on this aspect that I've seen growing in itself organically. It's kind of called to me as opposed to me finding it. I think it's found me. I never thought I'd find myself talking about issues of sacred and spirituality. I never thought I'd be a scholar who'd be looking at issues around, intergenerational, cosmological issues. But my working with women in my PhD more than a decade ago, where I interviewed 3 generations of women around experiences of suffering and healing, these issues came up and I had to engage them. Of course, myself, as someone who grew up in that particular township, myself, these resonated and kind of, have called into question, and me having to interrogate what is knowledge and what is legitimate. So what are legitimate sites of knowledge? So what I want to do today in this talk is to surface the neglected memory site, neglected memory sites that global violence systems of oppression and exclusion have, conveniently silenced in many ways. And these are they resurface in African women's narratives of remembrances of past historical political violence, as well as more recent violences under democratic rule. So what I'd like to argue in this talk is that the neglected area in African women's memories of oppression and violence has been their violations of the sacred, the spiritual. And this has a very huge impact on how we actually understand the notion of violence itself, of historical and political violence itself. So I draw on a number of perspectives. Principally, I draw on the three generations of women's life histories, drawn primarily from the work I did in my doctoral studies, which is still sitting there. I'm busy with the book right now, so throw me all your positive energy, please, for me to complete that book, which is based on my PhD study. So it draws on that, but I've also drawn on TRC testimonies. I've done quite a bit of work on African women's, African working class women's testimonies at the Truth and Reconciliation, and kind of what are the testimonies that come out of that, and the key areas that women, talk through in their testimonies. Recently, I was invited with, I think, oh, there she is. Yes, I can see there she is with Danai Maputa. We were part of a wonderful film festival, a gender film and dialogue festival, which was co-hosted by Nelson Mandela University Center for Women and Gender Studies and Yanaya Productions. And I was asked to be part of a panel discussion, which talked to documentary called You Strike a Rock, which is directed by the talented filmmaker Aliki Saragas. And it actually looked at two South African mother and friend, best friends who live in Marikana, and who are trying to cope with the tragedy that still echoes, till today, which claimed 37 striking migrant workers in 2012. So what's the thread? The thread from the Marikana documentary, You Strike a Rock, the thread from my work on women's, working class women's testimonies at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as my work which was very much situated in the township where I grew up. So there were interesting methodological issues there, where I grew up, where I talked to 3 generations of women. So the thread amongst all of these sort of, different sets of experiences by African women, and by particularly working class and poor women, is that what for me emerged from their testimonies, their narratives, from the film, was the construction of an African feminist and womanist epistemology. So it was the construction of African women's ways of knowing, very much contextually grounded, very much talking to sort of the feminist ideas around feminist knowledge, reflexive knowledge, etc. All of these three, to call them, data, experiences, etc., and voices of African women. What is also key amongst all these three areas that I draw on to talk through some of these issues around sacred violations and the healing of our historical wombs is that it centralizes African women's lives, as I said, and then also kind of journeys us on the ways that they come to know as well. So here, centralizing whole notions of meaning. What is meaningful in their lives? What are their versions of history, of violence, of oppression, of marginalization, of exclusion? And this has taken when you start to, something that was really fascinating for me when I started to look at these sort of three sites of knowledge production, three sites of African women voicing their experiences, was this this notion of alternative memory sites, which I coined, came through. So women would often take us to what I called alternative memory sites of how they constructed meanings in their lives, social meanings, spiritual meanings, and meanings really to survive and to humanize the environments. So these were often away from the grand narratives or the mainstream grand narratives. They were away from the museum construction of kind of what is memory. And they took us to these really, these alternative memory sites, which were the body, dreams, tears, and songs and cloth. Is the cloth, it's called a butterfly dress made by Ghanaian women. So they take us to sartorial practices. They take to all these alternatives. They take us to cosmology, to the spiritual, and it kind of just reconstructs a whole historiography of apartheid when you start to really listen carefully and really take note of what Orenke called, world views and sense views of African women. It expands notions of knowledge, nations of memory, and the historiography of apartheid itself, the historiography of colonialism itself, and the historiography of democracy itself. When you take, the lived knowledges and body knowledges of these women, and the construction of theory, as would be said from below. So as I've said, this is still it's kind of it's experiential work. The interesting, issues of, I'm just going to run through some of the themes that came out from the TRC testimonies, as well as some of the PhD from women's recollections. And then I'll kind of zoom into the issue of sacred spiritual violations and how, interestingly, so when I was asked to be part of the Gender Film and Dialogue Festival, and I was asked to be a panelist on You Strike a Rock. What struck me, and I didn't even expect to find this, was the resonance of the TRC testimonies, which obviously the Truth and Conciliation Commission testimonies were drawn out of apartheid violence, experiences of political violence, drawn from 1960 up until it was 1984, I think, 1994, sorry, the advent of democracy. So you had women obviously coming through to tell their stories and their memories of violence and under violent apartheid rule. I did not expect to find a continuity with the narratives of the women of Marikana. So that said a lot around, what needs to be done and where we're at in terms of women's violations and violence and the general violences against women, and how intergenerationally you know, we are reproducing, women are re-experiencing, women are what has been, you know, people would call it, we're living the present in historical terms, you know, we're here, but there's this repetition. So some of the themes that emerge from my work on women's memories of political violence during high apartheid, in particular, that is the high apartheid of the 1980s, were the following. Which was political violence and the violation of sanctuary space, the violation of home, the attack of African family structures and values. So I looked at that, at the physical violation of the home, the kind of the inversion of meaning around what should be safe space when it, you know, when it was violated by political codes and politicized to the extent that it was in the 1980s. Women also, interestingly, in the Truth and Commission testimonies, they talk a lot around political violence and the damage of possessions. And someone would think, but really, you know, when your life is at stake, possessions, material objects, but work has been done, even as in South, you know, people who work on, worked on South American Violence Truth Commission and the violence in South America. In fact, I also picked it up when I was reading through testimonies from survivors from the Holocaust, this issue of attachment to a possession, to possessions as an extension of self. So women, you know, we talk around, you know, the burnings of their furniture, their sofas, their fridges, their room dividers, because often this is their investment, and often poor women in the context, in this particular moment, would have, you know, over a period of time, have acquired this by saving over a period of time. So that came out quite strongly in the narratives as well. The issue of then one of them, which I'm honing in today, was the political violence and the defilement of sacred space. So really the impact of violence on African cosmology and spirituality, as well as spaces, what I'm calling sacred spaces, funeral space, and such spaces. The issue of political and violence and bloody landscapes also came up, of how violence, you know, is the extension of violence onto the topography. Women spoke about, and I'll speak about that as a part of sacred violation. Of course, I've done some work on political violation and silences. And also what I traced from within their narratives is this whole notion of women's resistance and political consciousness, and how political consciousness normally, you know, for women, for many of these women, rather, working class ordinary women, was through looking for their children. So it was, you know, it was the search of a child who had not surfaced, couldn't find. So they, you know, you would then go to the police station, to the mortuary, to the hospital, to the looking, and through those actions, through that experiences, you see a very interesting route of politicization of women. Again, documented, there's quite a lot of very interesting documentation in Argentina around the mothers of the disappeared, which becomes a political organized form of political organizing by women, which is structured through experiences of motherhood. So motherhood becomes the political tool. So that came out quite, you know, strongly. And again, when I then, when I did the review of the You Strike a Rock, I was just struck, by the way in which I said to the filmmaker that she's actually through her very sensitive film making, she's actually constructed an African feminist and womanist epistemology. So again, you see in this documentary, which I'm encouraging you all please to watch, which follows the lives of Matumega and Masonti, who are the protagonists. and you know, and how they are surviving the post-Marikana massacre. The centrality of everyday to tell women's stories come out very strongly as well. So you see in the way that she does, even in the film itself, women are narrating through as they are washing clothes, and the back, these women are in an informal settlement, what we would call him Jondolo. You know, a shack area, Marikana. So these stories are told of violence as they wash, as they are doing hand washing, as they are cooking, as they are feeding children. As the filming is going on, they are busy preparing a meal for the child. They're combing and plaiting children's hair, and etc. As they tell their narratives of agency and trauma. And of course, for me, this sort of intergenerational experiences of both agency and trauma by African women, the materiality is, again, as in the TRC Commission testimonies, the whole issue of centrality of you see it viscerally through women, because they're engaged in the everyday, because they are engaged in you know, the what we would call the mundane, the washing, the cooking, etc. So you're really able to really have a visceral sense of material conditions of poverty, the living in shacks, the lack of access to water, roads, electricity, the cleavages in class, you know, the class cleavages, the making of dignity within poverty. And the way that the political economy is very much central rather than absent from women's narratives. It is in fact core. Land and landlessness are stuck in this documentary, and that comes up as well in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'll talk about the issue of land, as I made mention in the bloody landscape. Land is interwoven within these narratives, and women continue to talk about it. It's the same narrative of displacement, of physical and spiritual displacement, you know, and interestingly, they links within a much broader sense of displacement within a Pan-Africanist context as well. The centrality of song, the centrality of fabulous dress, the self-color and dress, the centrality of prayer was startling as well. And that is something I will also just touch on when I talk about sacred violations that came out also very strongly in women's as a, you know, prayer as a site or as a memory site, or what I have, you know, called as women's speeches of desire, prayer. So prayer also was central. Almost, you know, every other clip in the documentary, there is women are praying in some way or form. The politicization of wifehood, of motherhood, of grandmotherhood, of widowhood, and obviously how social mothering plays a key role continues in Marikana. Narrative continues in 2012, you know, almost 20 years more than after democracy, we're seeing the same repeated narratives of violence, and in particular sacred violations. And as well as other things, of course, of women's support networks, emotional, socio-psychological support networks, social mothering, and the mainstreaming. In particular, what was interesting for me with the documentary was this whole notion of mainstreaming activist knowledges, of really taking seriously ways of integrating activist knowledges within mainstream academia. And I suppose what I was trying to do also in my work, looking at Truth and Reconciliation Commission, women's testimony, poor and working class women's testimonies, as well as my PhD, we looked at 3 generations of women who came from ghettos, who came from RDP houses, as well as 4-roomed houses where I grew up, It was about finding ways of integrating what these historically marginalized knowledges into mainstream in academia. Carolyn Cooper, and she's a cultural theorist, African feminist womanist from the Caribbean. She's often, known to say that academia is actually catching up to the lexicon of the street. And I would argue similarly with African women's epistemologies and ways of knowing African women's knowledges, that we are actually, we have to adopt experiential approaches, because we really are, as scholars, catching up what is already there, and finding ways in which to comprehend and understand it and bring it into as part of mainstream knowledge. So that really is, the dialogue, the three informing dialogues that inform this. And I just wanted to add that please don't be surprised if you find me dialoguing with some South American and Native American scholars as well. I've been recently reading the classic feminist anthology, The Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color. I'm sure many of you know this, edited by Sherry Moraga, as well as Gloria Alzadua. First published by Pesphone, then Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press in 1981. So I've been reading that. So I've kind of brought it in here and there, of trying to create this notion of a dialogue of, African women dialoguing with South American feminist scholars, dialoguing with Native American scholars, dialoguing with, scholars as a global project. We're involved in a global project of ensuring that these marginalized knowledges are brought to the center, and in fact radically reorganize and make us rethink of what we consider knowledge itself, and memory sites, and and methodologies. So it is really part of sitting. I'm part of something so much bigger. I deny all of you. I see Prof. Prof. Deidre is also here. All of you, Lenka, are involved in the very same, a very similar global project. So what I'd like to do is just begin the talk by bringing into view the following neglected sacred spiritual memory sites, which women's recollections surface in their memories of past, both recent violence as well as violence under democracy. The centrality of death as an organizing principle in African community, and how it continues to be women's burden. The participation, of course, some of these, just sorry to cut off quickly. Of course, some of this, what's really interesting is some of this is, as I'm reading it, COVID-19 is just coming in, in my head as well. So there's a lot of resonances you can actually include as part of TRC testimonies, 3 generations of poor and working class women's narrative in a small township in KwaZulu-Natal, the women of Marikana post Marikana, a massacre. You could actually, also include their recent experiences of COVID-19 and start to think through of how some of these themes are beginning to take root or starting to surface within women's experiences of COVID-19 in these communities as well. And not only in South Africa, but around the world, women who live in these spaces which are have a history of social exclusion, economic exclusion, and historical violence as well around the world. Favelas, Brazil, slums in India, projects in the US, shanty towns in Jamaica, slums and ghettos in Africa, around through all the, the major cities around the continent. So, experiment that is very local as we talk about it, but has a very much a global resonance of what women, or to think through what women are also experiencing in these particular marginal spaces around the world. So as I say, the centrality of death continues to be women's burden, and it continues to structure social experience. The participation, I was very interested in how we also edit out in social theory, how we edit out in the social science and humanities, how we edit out the participation of oppressive states, particularly I'm talking apartheid states here, in the separation or the hiding of the dead from the living, and the consequences of that, the grave, sacred, socio-spiritual consequences on cosmology and the idea of an African personhood which are caused by these violent separations. Violent deaths, the issues around violent deaths and the dangers of restless spirits that many people believe haunt us till today, are with us rather till today. The disappeared and the missing, and the consequences of mourning without reflexivity. The consequences of mourning without reflexivity. I'd like you to just also hold on to that, especially given the current COVID-19 moment, where we're seeing the kind of organization of death practices, funeral practices, and people and individuals not being able to fully mourn the dead, and the consequence of that as well. Women also talk about funeral space violations and the denials of having a proper burial for their often, but it was often sons and husbands, and during apartheid. And then, of course, the big one that I've come also getting quite interested in. I haven't done much work on it, but women bring up in their narratives, as I said, it came up in Marikana, it comes up in the TRC testimonies strongly as well, and it came up very strongly in my life histories with women in Chesterville Township, and that is land dispossession as a form of spiritual uprootedness, and of course the blooding effects of political violence on landscapes. So this is what when I talk about, when I'm talking landscapes, I'm talking land disposition, I'm talking issues of violation of funeral space, proper burial, violent death, separation of the living from the dead and the living dead, the ancestral, and how women's testimonies bring these things up, and how then they force us to really kind of reflect of, what is violence? Actually, have we been defining violence in the way, as feminists, as scholars in the humanities and social sciences, as we should? And why have we been editing some of these experiences? These memories of intergenerationally lived and embodied suffering, which emerge from the experience of living with regular deaths. That's something that comes out also very strongly from these three sites, is African women's repeated experience of regular death. And it just still blows my mind how in social theory, we browse over this. We haven't kind of really come to grips, particularly when, death as a cultural practice becomes a woman's burden and continues to be. They come out of the experience, all of these come out of the experience of unbearable and prolonged suffering. And I'd like to just tenderly weave some of these issues in the talk today and call them knowledge and, situate them as a counter epistemological resource for us as scholars to think through notions of violence, notions of historiography, notions of memory, and notions of the wounding of women's bodies intergenerationally, and how we carry that through in our work presently. So what I'd like to, also maybe briefly touch on, very briefly, because I'm also thinking, as I say, this is very experiential. I'm thinking through some of these concepts, is to really briefly explore how women utilize African worldviews and sense views. How when we focus on the socio-historical and the socio-cultural, including, of course, the socio-political and the socio-economic as well. But when we kind of magnify that, which is what, wominists tend to focus on, have a leaning towards, when we explore how they use this as epistemological resource, how they use African spiritualities and cosmologies, how women use their bodies as part of a counter epistemological resource and practice and break from a wounded past. So women do all kinds of very interesting things that we might be able to talk about as well. And some of the ones that I've listed is how the cleansing of historically wounded bodies. I found it when I was doing my thesis that came out very as a huge issue, the issue of social healing, and how women repair mutilated sensory past that have been numbed by violence, by using African-based, cosmological practices, as well as centralizing the African worldview and sense view, and how they engage in the clearing of bloodied landscapes through what they call ecological. I think UNISA from UNISA called. I'll get his name, and now I have it somewhere. He was looking at Izayon. His work is on Amazion, and how as some of you who know that African faith-based, they use circles a lot. They do a lot of circling, and how part of that is a part of a healing process of doing an ecological reversal on a wounded earth, on a wounded, a mutilated landscape. So, and really what this brings to the fore is also the aspect of agency, which we can never lose sight of, even in the most horrendous of, in the most brutal of experiences, such as colonialism, such as apartheid, such as Marikana. The power of female power. They centralize female power, and they centralize, for me, what's really important that I think as also as Feminist Week, we need to do these interconnections more, which is female power and maternal legacies. Am I running out of time? 5 minutes. So as we kind of move in that, I haven't even really read my paper, as usual. But I really wanted to just call into focus also methodological, maybe throw that in there, a methodological tool, which I have used, and it's nothing creative from me. I found that other, African scholars as well as writers use this methodology to inhabit maternal ancestral memories of pain. And that is this whole notion of possession as a tool. So part of the use of possession as a tool to inhabit maternal ancestral memories of pain by African women comes from the notion by people like Jackie Alexander, who wrote the book Pedagogies of the Crossing, Mediations on Feminism, Sexual Politics, Memory, and the Sacred. It's one of my key texts that I like to refer to. In fact, she was a radical transnational feminist, part of the generation of Al-Zadua and Sheri, and she later became a healer. She trained in the Congo. She's from the transnational sort of feminist networks, and she's was trained in the Congo. She is from the Caribbean. She's from Jamaica. She's a Jamaican radical feminist, and is now currently living in, she lives in Canada. So she mentions this notion that the healer's knowledge is carried in her body, and that also wanting to introduce maybe here as well this notion of scholars as healers as well. I'm going to read straight from the text. The pages, since I have 5 minutes, and just leave it there. How do we begin to trace and identify non-hegemonic memory sites hidden in women's violence past? How do we access them? Who legitimates these memory sites? What do they look and feel like? These are just some of the questions that have preoccupied African women writers and scholars who have repeatedly turned back to the body as a legitimate site of knowledge and memory. This is because African women have always intuitively known the power of their bodies as a site to trigger and to access ancestral memories through possession. And it also was something that was really, for me, really interesting and important, because if I was looking for a methodological a methodology that would be holistic, reflexive, as well as flexible as possible, as I experientially looked, and listened to women's narratives in townships. And what was interesting is that as I was looking at some of the work, I came across this metaphor of spiritual possession and dreams as a very useful way of kind of, securing this methodological ground. And part of this is because the trope is essentially double-edged to both reclaim women's tongues, as Carolyn Cooper said, as well as to warn us about the possible dangers of zombification that are carried from consuming unlimited amounts of Western-based theories, which Carolyn Cooper calls poisonous knowledge. Interestingly, when I discovered the number of creative writers who actually use this form, this methodology, Hazel Tafatsa Ngoshi, in her article, Recovering the Tongue, Memorializing Grieved Women Through Spirit Possession and Ritual in Zimbabwean Literature, says that the trope of spirit possession, ancestral memories have been effectively used to inscribe female subjectivity in African cultural memory and consciousness. And part of this, of course, is that this position is documented as a feminine response. It's a subaltern discourse. It's a feminine response to hegemonic practices across cultures. And Jane Bryce, when she looked at Yvonne Vere's work, some of you know her work on Nahanda, Yvonne evokes also possession as how she came to actually embody the spirit of Nahanda, and she writes, it's as if I were a spirit medium and I was just conveying the feelings, the symbols and images of that. I wrote it at a time when I could write it the way one might write a folk song. Today, probably, would spoil it. I wrote it from remembrance as a witness to my own spiritual history. So other writers have again, appropriated this idea of embodied possession as a way of extracting meaning. And what is really powerful for me, and I will stop here, Leandra, leaving other things, is in terms of, from an epistemological point of view, is how this also draws, when I started, as I was doing the reading, how it draws very closely to what has been called the diviners epistemology, or diviners ways of knowing. It is known that diviners extract meanings from dreams, from their bodies, from intuitions, the senses, the lived, and the spiritual worlds to construct situated knowledges. In other words, in their practice, diviners mediate between various knowledge systems, sources of information, and sensory modes. They embrace multiple modes of thought, the senses, the reasoning mind, the body, the spiritual, and collapse them all to create a coherent view of the social situation that is subjectively meaningful to specific communities and individuals. As Vambe has noted in his book on ancestor spirit possession and post-colonial resistance, spiritual possession represents a world decentered, horizontal, ambivalent, which often enters into radical conflict with the Eurocentric and masculine image of the world designed by reason that is vertical, that is uniform and centralized. Such a mode of constructing and legitimizing knowledge provides a powerful framework that may heal us in ways that are whole. I think it was, again, J.K. Alexander who says, let me just find the quote, who talks about healing work as the antidote of oppression. And so what I'd like to really, and having had time and we can go into this, I'll just read the headings of the sacred violations I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about land disposition as embodied spiritual displacement and how land holds memory. I wanted to talk about the separation of the living from the living dead, the ancestral, and kind of the ramification. These are narratives that come out of women's narratives as violation to self, to community, to continuity, to intergenerational continuity of being and of the family structure in an African community. The notion of bloody landscape, women living under the constancy of death, which is remarkable in South Africa. And of course, the state culpability on the separation of the living and the dead, the violations of funerals and funeral space, and, reflecting on how through this idea of possession, of inhabiting ancestral memory, of linking maternal legacies, of centralizing the African world and sense view, we can begin, the process of healing our historical and generational wombs, where African female power is centralized. And as I say, African women's maternal legacies are brought to the center as a legitimate site of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nthabiseng, and it really breaks my heart to have to be the one that stops you at this point. It was such a fantastic keynote, and I think we are all going to spend quite a bit of time looking into your research and following your thinking on these subjects. And I just want to congratulate you on what seems to be an incredibly rich archive that you are contributing to, not only constituting, but also writing it up in the archive, which is so very important. I'm going to somewhat limit my response because I want to give other people a chance to respond as well. So I'll just highlight one thing for me that, that really stood out for me. And this was your focus of the role on the everyday of telling women's stories. And while you were speaking, I couldn't help but be reminded of a little scenario or anecdote that Gayatri Spivak evokes in the opening of one of her essays. And you've mentioned a feminist or subaltern response, so I thought it might be appropriate to bring it up over here. But she tells the story of, so she's from a privileged class and she's walking her father's estate in Kolkata, and she comes across washerwomen who are busy washing their clothing in the river. And so the washerwomen are kind of bickering about who's allowed to wash in the river and who is not. And so the one says to the other one, "Yo, you can't wash in the river, this is our river." And then so they kind of back and forth like this. And then one says, "But hang on, it's nobody's river, the river belongs to the company. So the river belongs to the East India Company." So what Spivak is trying to say through this scenario is that just because the washerwomen are ordinary women, poorer working class women, it doesn't mean that they don't know what's going on. And this really recenters, like you say, it makes us radically rethink what we consider as knowledge. So I thought I'll just put that one in there, and I'd really like to open the floor to anyone who might have any questions. I'm checking the chat box. I'm not seeing anything over there, so I'm inviting people to please ask a question. Caja Negra, I think that's Natalia, your hand is raised. There you go.
Yes, I want to ask a question. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation and for your work. I found it very, very important. And I'm actually now I'm trying to build like a theoretical bridge between your concept, or the concept that you use, of survival wisdom, with what Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, a scholar from Bolivia, uses this idea of the economy as something spiritual, like some economic practices, not in a capitalist way, but with a spiritual meaning.
I do understand that.
I'm trying to use that in a feminist economics, with a feminist economics perspective. And this idea of the work that sustains life, or the sustainability of life. And I just would love to hear what you think about the link between survival wisdom, spirituality, and economic practices of the everyday performed by women.
Survival wisdom, economic spirituality,
yes,
and economic practices.
Yes.
Wow. That is fascinating. So what's interesting about what I was trying to draw out earlier on with the women of the Marikana. Can I respond, Leandra? Sorry. Okay, through you, Leandra. I'm jumping in there. It's just a fascinating question that I haven't thought through in making those the links. But what I was trying to, I think I said when I mentioned earlier with the You Strike a Rock documentary, as also for me, it really was a feminist, epistemological rooted film, was the centrality of the material. So you get that coming out striking. And how do you get it coming out? You get it coming out through women's everyday practices. So as you're seeing her doing the washing, Leandra, she's got her, she's doing the washing because she's got the water on her head, and she puts it down and she starts to do the washing. So already there's this kind of backdrop narrative of poverty and what she has to endure, each day in order to. So they're very central. So women's, the material is very central in women's survival practices. And also, I think in also bringing in earlier the issue of, which I didn't get to talk about, the issue of women and bloodied landscapes, and how it's so interesting for me that women, when they talk about healing, they not only talk about the self as self-healing, they talk about yourself, and through when I'm using kind of coming through the African world sense view, they talk about the purification of the body, something that I think I may say I'm very attracted to that notion of that decolonization must include a detoxification of the body. So that's Amesize kind of, as work, and it made absolute sense. It makes absolute sense to me that when you kind of put this within a political model like liberalism, which to me echoes Fanon's notion of colonialism was a process of thingification, of making us as Africans, as people of whatever, from marginals, from third world, the so-called what early feminists called the third world, as things. So there's a way in which this is why the centralization of the body, I'd like to see in your feminist economics, the body has to be very much present. So I'm trying to kind of get there on one level, because, you know, capitalism and neoliberalism is all about commodification, thingification, and so this toxification and return back to the body becomes very interesting, and you know, around women's narratives or women's agency. The body is key. But too, what's interesting for me was this whole idea of the landscape and how women. So if you're coming up with kind of a feminist, you know, economics, and women, feminist economics will have, central to that will have to be spirituality. Largely because, you know, Jackie Alexander, actually in her book on memory, spirituality and feminist reflections, she writes that a lot of feminists are in a closet, are in a spiritual closet. We don't want to be associated with this notion. And in fact, she calls, and that is why I actually also reference The Bridge Called My Bag, because The Bridge Called My Bag, being a text by, so I'm very happy with you saying you're from Bolivia, a text that was, you know, it was South American women. It was really around women wanting to say the spiritual violation must constitute as part of knowledge making. So spirituality is going to have to feature in some way or form in that film, because women have used the spiritual as their, let's call it the body, in particular the body. And this is documented. It's not just women, it's oppressed around the world will use the body as if I don't have anything in the world, if I've been stripped of everything in the world, the one thing I do have is this is mine. You know, yes, we talk as feminists how it's kind of objectifies, etc., but this is mine. So body central, spirituality central is part of the alternative memory sites that I'm talking about, where women draw a life force, where women construct agency, dreams become important. In fact, in my work on linking both what you, Kaja, and Leandro said, in my work when I looked at land, land becomes important, land as a spiritual violation. Women, you know, there's fascinating work on displacement. In fact, the one I think is on Bolivia, on displacement, and how women, these interconnections of selfhood and women, and how land holds memory becomes also central as well. So, you know, all of these alternative memories that we put on the side in trying to construct, to me, a feminist based economic practices, you're going to have to go to some of and visit some of these notions, because the survival of wisdom, what I'm, you know, saying essentially is the survival wisdom of women it will be based on these alternative sites that we normally don't tap into. And so that kind of, in constructing this feminist economic practice, it's going to have to tap into some of those things. I mean, one of the things that I'm quite interested in, and I'd like to, anybody interested, please, you can get my email from Lenka. I'd like to, in some, maybe next year, this year, to do a special issue on the commodification of desire. So the material basis of design, how that is absolutely linked to the neoliberal model of how women have commodified desire in poor, marginalized areas of the world. My particular interest is in, obviously, in township, and how women, the privatization of electricity intersects with notions of intimacy, intersects with commodifying desire, and desire, you know, the material basis of desire. So there's just, you know, there's so much to debunk, I think, around even the big questions on economics, what constitutes exchange. In the Kaja, you and I, but I'm liking that connection. It's just, I'm talking as I'm thinking through it, because I haven't actively, but I can see really fascinating spaces that it can go to. So perhaps we can even pick up after this and continue the dialogue. It's really fascinating. Your work sounds fascinating.
Thank you so much for your question, Natalia, and for your response, Nthabiseng. I think while we're still waiting for other people to speak up or to post something in the chat, I just want to pick up on this idea where you talk about scholars as healers, Nthabiseng. So you talk about César and the importance of detoxifying the body, but I think if we can think a moment about the detoxification of academia and the knowledge economy. So I would like to ask you, what is it like, what does it feel like to work both in and against this system that used to do a major part of the editing out that you have been talking about, in terms of methodology, but also how we function within these systems as scholars that have edited us out, that have edited out women, poor people, and people of color. What does that feel like for you?
This is a conversation, feminists have been having for the longest of time. Of course, particularly Black feminists, African feminists have centered it even further, through this notion of intersectionality. But I think, such a big one. I think I loved working with the feminist notion, or that a feminist consciousness. So I wrote a paper a few years ago where I was talking to young Black feminist scholars, which was entitled, was it The Third Eye? Feminist consciousness, how feminist consciousness allows you to navigate a racist, a sexist, exclusionary terrain, such as, currently, unfortunately, academia at the moment. So, and I spoke about how actually feminist consciousness enables you you're able to have a consciousness where you already know where the minefields are. And part of that is that as African feminists, back to the body, is that embodied knowledge is very important. It's part of what is within survival wisdom, body knowledge. In fact, my work, my theoretical work, I draw on two fundamental kind of theoretical positions. One is African feminist and womanist theory. The other one that I got attracted to was existential phenomenology. And I got attracted to Merleau-Ponty's existential phenomenology because it says the body has consciousness, the body speaks, So I'm always trying to kind of, center African ways, women's ways of knowing and the body's ways of knowing. And part of centralizing the woman or body's ways of knowing is because marginalized across the world, including, women, will use their bodies as a form of agency to speak back to power, to subvert power, to complicate, power and to undermine. So I kind of, this notion of also the senses. I think I spoke earlier about sensory parts of the senses, of using African feminist notions of we need to think beyond worldviews, but sense views, of kind of the senses being really central as part of survival wisdom. If I don't feel you, I'm not feeling you. If I walk into a room and very much people who speak, I'm not sure in English or African, but who speak African language, you will identify there's a lot of the hearing is a huge sense and still a very central. So I don't hear this room. I'm not feeling it in my blood. We rely on that form of knowledge, on this also, on body knowledge. We rely on dreams as a source of knowledge. We rely on all these alternative forms of knowledge as a way of making sense of and transversing very hostile terrains. So a lot of, as you say, a lot of African feminist women's work, has been around exactly that question, Leandra, of how do we maneuver being part of the space, but subverting it, and in fact, in the subversion, also transforming it from the root. It's a very delicate thing, but apart from me, my own kind of response, African, feminist womanist response would be really focusing also back on the socio-cultural and the socio-historical, making the historical link, drawing on the maternal legacies, where we're going to be able to fundamentally bring into the the incredible survival wisdom, as well as the other term that I use now, I've forgotten, Keja, in my previous work, that to inform what constitutes knowledge. So I think I do believe women's knowledges, and I do this work because I truly do believe this, but I do believe engaging in poor women's knowledges, in poor women's and working class women's ideas of what constitutes knowledge will fundamentally enlarge our epistemic frames, our methodological tools, and lead us to, which is the center of my own project, the rehumanization of all of us, not just African women who have been the ones who have kind of been at the bottom of the boot, but will rehumanize all of us towards horizons of hope. So I really do that because I from the narratives you already can see where they take us when they talk about violence. They're not talking about just, there's the issues, the spiritual, there's the issue of topography, there's dreams. So there's all of these other things that they bring to the fore. So yeah.
I'm going to, Nthabiseng, there's a question in the chat box. So perhaps we can end this off over here. It's from, to close. So can you see that? Shall I read it out so that people can just hear it? So Belinda Deploy says, very interesting work. Thank you very much for sharing. Have similar studies been done with men in the same demographic as your study? One wonders if similar themes, land, prayer, bodies, spirituality, possession, legacy, etc., would emerge from men's narratives or not, or how these themes would be manifested differently in men's narratives. A comparison would be insightful and may possibly help us to dismantle normative stereotypes about masculinity or manhood as necessarily stoic, violating, aggressive, disconnected from the body and spirituality, etc., and may present examples from lived experience that are different, which is an essential part of feminist work.
No, I'm not yet. I'm sure there are, of course, studies that are out there. I certainly, within a South African context, to name one specifically, I'm thinking of Kopane Ratele's work would most probably touch on some of these kinds of issues, because his work is really about dismantling, stereotypical notions of African men and kind of manhood, notions of manhood. Interestingly, the Stoic, I see Stoic is a very strong image among African women as well, as part of a kind of an embodiment of survival. So the Stoic figure is very, quite big, particularly when I was interviewing mothers, grandmothers, mothers and daughters was particularly strong, obviously amongst grandmothers and mothers. So Stoicism as kind of this embodiment of grace and embodiment of dignity is really also very interesting. I actually came across fascinating work in Eastern Europe out of, I didn't expect, which looked at the Stoic figure in Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, as well as some writings by Japanese feminists. So that's actually, so just interesting that it's associated with manhood here. But that would be interesting, I think, as an interesting project. But I suppose on my side, we haven't even begun. We're just we're starting on opening up the, the exploration with women and seeing how, the interest here for me, it really goes back to the project of decolonization of decolonizing knowledges and making our knowledge system more inclusive, democratic. So it's the idea that multiple knowledge systems can exist equally alongside each other. And at the moment, my project is to center the African-centered perspective, because largely, obviously, because it's been marginalized, and to see what we can find, what is there that we can all learn as well. So that really is, I think, for me, at the moment, the key is to focus on a group that I believe has been the most oppressed, which is African women, and see what we can learn from them. And then perhaps we can begin to also have conversations with people who are working, like Professor Kopano Ratele, who are working on these kinds of issues as well.
Thank you so much, Nthabiseng, and thank you for reminding us of Kopano's incredible work that he's also doing. We can all link. I posted his name there in the chat box for us, so we can also go follow up on his writings. And then it again breaks my heart to have to be the one to stop this afternoon's session. It's been really wonderful listening to you, Nthabiseng. It's been just a real honor to just hear you speak about the work that you're doing that's so very much prioritizing women's agency, both their stories and their agency in all of this. And I'm sure that is a theme that we will be picking up on a lot throughout this conference. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your labor in doing this work and sharing it with us. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to sharing the rest of this conference with you. And I also just wanted to thank everyone who was tuning in to listen to this.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lovely participation. And we hope you have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you again tomorrow for the rest of the conference, where we're looking forward to the rest of this week. Thank you, Nthabiseng.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a lovely conference.